Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We apologize for the delay. 196 was a nightmare. Maybe you already figured that one out. So thanks again for being with us. So tonight is the first presentation in a series called Voices of Indigenous People for Community and Healing, and it's presented by the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan in collaboration with Kent District Library. I'm Erica Kubik, the Director of Programming for the Council, and on behalf of my colleagues Michael Van Denen and Rachel Brooks and the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council, I welcome all of you. The Council's mission is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. To change the world, we believe one must first know the world, and you can learn more about what we do at worldmichigan.org. Tonight, we say a special thank you to our friends at Kent District Library, who annually partner with us to provide this free informational resource to the West Michigan community. I welcome Randy Goebel, Director of Engagement at KDL, to share what's happening at the library.
Good evening, I'm Randy Goebel. I'm the Director of Engagement with Kent District Library. Welcome to the Granville branch. If you've not been here before, welcome. If you have been here before, welcome back. This is about a 2-year-old renovation to this building. This section is all new. Everything inside was renovated to make it more open for guests, and it's a beautiful space and serves a lot of people in the community. So again, welcome. A few housekeeping rules. The restrooms are outside the hall to your left. If you have cell phones, who doesn't have a cell phone? Please make sure they're muted. And at the end of the event, there will be an opportunity for meeting Patricia and purchase books too. But one of the things I wanted to mention is that the Kent District Library acknowledges that we're situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabegamig, or the Three Fires Confederacy, considered the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi tribes. While the Treaty of Chicago in 1821 sold most of the land south of the Grand River, and the Treaty of Washington in 1836 sold most of the land north of the river, we acknowledge the vibrancy and continued presence of Native peoples in our community. Kent District Library is committed for everybody who walks through the doors of the library to be able to see themselves in the collection, the services, the people that work here, and we welcome all. It's our purpose to further all people. We also acknowledge that this program comes with the people who come to this program come with different backgrounds and experiences, and because this series highlights the ongoing struggles with colonialism, the content is distressing. So we invite you to reflect on the topic in a way that takes your own safety in consideration, as well as the safety of others in the audience. And with that, I'll hand it back to Erica.
All right. Is this a little better? So we're pleased to have Patricia Shackleton here. She's the Executive Director of the Anishinaabegamig Cultural Center in Haslett, Michigan. Patricia has been in this position for 23 years. And prior to this work, she was a resource specialist and the Mackinac County Elder Program Coordinator for the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of the Chippewa Indians in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. Patricia has built a strong reputation as a principal investigator and scientific researcher specializing in issues related to American Indian populations. She has degrees from Lake Superior State University and Central Michigan University in History and Management Sciences. After Patricia's presentation this evening, there will be ample time for questions, and please exhibit civility to our guests and hospitality to others by asking succinct and respectful questions. Her presentation tonight is titled The History and Consequences of Indigenous Boarding Schools in Michigan and Beyond. Let's welcome Patricia Shackleton.
Good evening, folks. Can you hear me with this?
Yes.
Okay, very good. I think I'm going to start out a little bit about how I came to put so much time into Indian country. I grew up in Sault Ste. Marie, and I think that there's probably some things you need to know more about northern Michigan before we get started. Growing up in Sault Ste. Marie, in 1969, there were results that came out about the various areas of the United States and where there was poverty. And the Appalachian area happened to be at the top of the list, and everybody was concerned about Appalachia, and there was a lot of funding that was put towards that. The number 2 place was the eastern end of the Upper Peninsula, and we didn't really get recognized for that. But I can tell you in growing up that I was fortunate. A middle-class livelihood that my father was able to provide was like being some of the wealthiest people in town. It was a very, very poor community. My first job out of college, I ended up working for a Social Security Administration, and that's when I started being a witness for people who are still making marks. It was a very deprived area. As time went on, my tribe was able to develop more. Now, in 1978, our tribe had to be involved with the federal government, and they took the city fathers to task for what had been going on in the Sioux. And what had been going on is that the Indian area was inside the 3-mile city limit of Sault Ste. Marie. And Sault Ste. Marie, by the way, is over 350 years old. So it's over 100 years older than this nation. And yet, in that 3-mile city limit, in 1978, there was still no water and no sewage inside city limits in the Indian neighborhood. The federal government had to intervene and say, you do have to plumb this. You do have to give these people services. You're taking their tax money for it. They're paying for these services, and you're not giving it to them. Of course, their excuse was they wouldn't use the water anyway. So the city fathers still felt somewhat self-righteous about it. However, it did take that kind of intervention to get water in the Indian area. If any of you have been to Sault Ste. Marie, then you probably have been on Shunk Road, and this is the area in particular I'm talking about. 1978 was also another pivotal time too, because you see, Native Americans hadn't really been citizens of this country. That's part of the problem that the government had started with changing their policies on the way they treated Indians every 4 years. Every time there was a change in presidency, the way the Indians were treated was differently again. Excuse me, it's going to take a little bit for me to get everything out that I would like to tell you. That was the year that we got the right to religion. It was in 1978. Now, there may be freedom of religion for everybody else, but not for these non-citizens of the United States. There was no freedom of religion. In fact, that's the reason why there was the massacre by the American cavalry out in Minnesota of lynching 16 people. It was because they were dancing. So there are a lot of things that we have to celebrate, but the fact that there are powwows now and you never used to see them, that's the reason why. Dancing was against the law. It was in many, many states and various places throughout the country. It is illegal to walk down the main street in one's regalia, and that still exists. So we celebrate when we can to take advantage of these newfound freedoms that we've finally been able to obtain. However, like any act that goes through Congress, the right to religion can be revoked at any time for us as well. So I continued with my work career, and I did a lot of different things. And then as the tribe got bigger and was able to support more people in their jobs and employment, I was able to get a job working as an elderly program developer for our outlying areas. And I loved it. I loved it. I loved the people. I loved everything about it. I was working with a lot of the last of our first language speakers, and a lot of the folks that had been in the boarding schools as well. I told my friends, if they only knew that I sat in an office at St. Ignace and could hear the waves from the straits, and then my biggest work was to get in a federal car and drive over and have lunch with the elders in Hessel. It was like a dream come true. I found that a lot of our meetings, I found a lot of different things about the nature of the Native Americans. We would have meetings, and the meetings would really occur about an hour after the meeting stopped. That's when people finally got around to talking. But it was from being with these elders that it lit a fire. And that's why I continued on with my education. I had been actually discouraged on continuing on with education, which you don't even hear people say such a thing, and yet that was the advice I was given at Michigan State University, that if I were you, I wouldn't bother with a master's degree. So I went to Central. Because I went to Central, there was a reason for that too. I had gotten a job working as a policy analyst in the Lansing area, and I was able to provide a voice for the Native Americans in our area. I actually wrote the white paper for the Democratic caucus at that time, which a white paper is kind of a big deal. It is like the paper that explains all the different in and outs of what people are experiencing. After working with the House, I was working with trying to develop the numbers in the Lansing area. One thing that I found out rather quickly with grant writing is that you have to have numbers or people don't want to fund you. And we had no numbers on anything. So I worked with a coalition that had gathered data for Hispanics, but when it was time for the Indians to get their data together, all of a sudden all the grant money was gone. And it was because of that that I went back to school so that I could continue on. R.E. Olds Foundation felt very strongly about this, and you'll see as I go through the boarding school thing of why I'm bringing up the R.E. Olds Foundation and the work that was done afterwards. We found some health outcomes to be rather upsetting, and that is going to be some of the unexpected consequences of the Dawes Act. So I would like to do the introduction here because the dedication includes my husband. This was to thank the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan and all the members of Tribal Council for their support for this project and their belief that we can work together to create a better future. I also thank the R.E. Olds Foundation, who shares a vision of a healthy future for our children. And I also wish to thank my monitor, William P. McDermott, PhD, for his encouragement to continue the battle for social justice. So this is kind of out of order. Typically, every time that we start anything, we would like to start it with a prayer. So I just ask for a moment of silence, that this is all done in a good way. When we have sema or tobacco, that is supposed to have been the first plant that was created by the Creator, was the tobacco. And we respect that and put that down. So the word sema also has some interesting linguistic overtones. It also means I breathe. And what that means is everything that I say is a prayer. I can say good prayers, I can say bad prayers, I can put out what I want to put out to the universe, but I'm putting it out there. It's a prayer. So I'd like to say a couple things in Ojibwe for you. Does it help if I keep this closer rather than,
Yes.
okay. Nada, Patricia Shackleton, Nadijnakas, Kanoas, Nagizi Dodam, Maba, Kano, Gitchi Gumi Nini, Maba Danas, Anishinaabegamig. What I'm telling you is in Ojibwe, and it is the language of this land. Nada, I am Patricia Shackleton, but my name is Kanoas, which means little golden eagle. Nagizi Dodam, eagle Dodam, Maba canoe. Maba means and golden eagle in particular. Nadunjaba, the place from where I come, is Ba-Ting, which is the place of the rapids. Gitchi Gumi, Nini, that's the men of Lake Superior. Mabadanas, I am a daughter of these people. So, without further ado, let us begin the presentation this evening. By the way, I did present this at the Great Lakes History Conference, and it was very well received, so I do hope you enjoy it this evening too. We're going to cover the education of Indian children and the Dawes Act. In particular, it's going to be the Native American schooling techniques, the white perspective, and then the Indian experience. Native American schooling techniques were such that Native American children were educated for responsibilities that they would assume as adults, and it was by working with and imitating their elders. Grandparents played a very important role in the education of children. Spiritual development was nurtured and listened to respectfully. Children were treated with considerable dignity and respect. As you hear this, this is what they call preceptor, where you do an action and then it's imitated. So this was like you would see in a pharmaceutical school on how the children were educated. The spiritual development was nurtured and listened to respectfully. We did not believe in sending our children anywhere away from us until after the age of 7, because the first 7 years, like numerology, these were considered to be the God years. These were the years when a child would still be spiritually very connected through his spirit to where he came from. So we really tried to keep the children protected and listen very carefully to what they had to say. For the white perspective, there were changing federal policies, and they changed quite a bit, but 1865 is a pivotal year. I also am going to cover Pratt and the Indian boarding school years, which is 1875 and 1879, and then Thomas Morgan, who was a commissioner on the Indian Affairs from 1889 to 1893. The white perspective was that there should be vocational education only. That was put in place from 1901 to 1928. The only answer to the Indian problem was to assimilate Native Americans into Euro-American society. Education was quickly identified as a critical tool in accomplishing this goal. Congress routinely appropriated money for the Civilization Fund to transform Indians into the model of white pioneer settlers. Treaty agreements and the Civilization Fund had assumed a voluntary transformation of Indians. The assimilation policy was comprehensive and it was compulsory. So what I'm telling you is that it was identified that it was easier and cheaper to educate than exterminate. This was also something that Adolf Hitler found really interesting, and he modeled a lot of his stuff after what he saw going on with the boarding schools. There's also some introduction of this being comprehensive and compulsory. I don't know if you can imagine what this would be like to have a 5-year-old torn out of your arms, just the way you were, and just the way your mother had been. This had gone on for many generations. There was no fighting it. With the white perspective on the Euro-American criticisms, there was something called the Merrick Report. I see you're taking notes, so I'm going to spell this. M-E-R-I-A-M, the Merriam Report. The Secretary of the Interior, Hubert Work, requested the Brookings Institute to investigate the Indian education. Lewis Merriam released in 1928 his findings that although there was centrality of vocational education, in practice, vocational training for the natives was poor. The report went on to criticize the physical plant of the schools, the care given to students, and the core ideas behind education in Indian schools. In 1875, Pratt was placed in charge of a group of 72 Indian prisoners near St. Augustine, Florida. Pratt developed a prison school to acculture prisoners into white society. Pratt opened Carlisle Industrial Training School on November 1st, 1879. Using the techniques learned with prisoners, Pratt isolated the students from their tribal cultures and attempted to fully assimilate the students into a European lifestyle. Christianity, Pratt believed, was an important element in becoming part of the European community, and Pratt was the first who held weekly Christian services. Government officials saw Carlisle as an alternative to the expensive and bloody Indian campaigns in the West. For the Morgan experience, Morgan believed Indians capable of significant intellectual achievement and argued that simply training Indians to be good farmers was insufficient. When Indians resisted Morgan's program, he responded quickly and harshly. In 1892, he wrote to the Secretary of the Interior, who responded approval to whatever it seems wise, resorting to mild punishment by withholding of rations or supplies, and where necessary, directing agents to use their Indian police as truant officers in compelling attendance. Statement from them. I do not believe that Indians, people who for the most part speak no English, live in squalor and degradation, make little progress from year to year, who are a perpetual source of expense to the government and a constant menace to thousands of their white neighbors, a hindrance to civilization and a clog on our progress, have any right to forcibly keep their children out of school to grow up like themselves, a race of barbarians and semi-savages. This will be the Indians' experience. First, we'll cover the parents' dilemma and then the students' first day, which will include daily routine, living conditions, use of English, health, food, punishment, and the fate of runaways. It is almost impossible to explain to a sympathetic white person what a typical old Indian boarding school was like, how it had affected the Indian child, suddenly dumped into it like a small creature from another world, helpless, defenseless, bewildered, trying desperately and instinctively to survive it all. Our mothers had taught us that only unskilled warriors who were captured had their hair shingled by the enemy. Among our people, short hair was worn by mourners and shingled hair by cowards. I would like to talk a little bit about the hair issue. Now, we all know as adults that these children had their hair cut and they were deloused. We know that. Explain that to a 5-year-old. This was just a terrifying experience. They were having kerosene thrown on them, powder thrown on them, their hair cut off, their clothes taken away from them. So it was confusing for a 5-year-old, and this was the kind of processing in that they received. As defined in school rules, students lived in a quasi-military lifestyle. They wore uniforms, were organized into companies under the command of student captains and majors, and were marched from activity to activity. The student's day was divided roughly in half. A half day was spent in class. The balance of the day was either spent in vocational education, which could consist either of formal study or work detail. The outing system was employed in Mount Pleasant, particularly during the summer. Male students served as seasonal laborers on area farms, while female students often found summer employment as domestic help. By the 20th century, school buildings were often run down and crowded. Children usually slept in dormitories that placed 30 or 40 students in a large room. Students bathed once or twice weekly, otherwise washing in communal troughs. Soap, in the Merriam Report, was rarely immediately accessible. The Merriam Report also found indoor toilets in poor repair, and at least half of the toilets visited by report staff lacking in toilet paper due to budget shortfalls. Students had very little privacy. They slept and ate in communal facilities. After bathing or showering, the students used communal dressing rooms equipped with long wooden benches to dry and dress. Correspondence were either sent to or written by the student was routinely read and screened by school staff. An Indian caught speaking native language might have his or her mouth washed out with soap or suffer some other more severe penalty. Children were strongly encouraged to accept a Christian name to replace their Indian name. School officials considered Indian names pagan. Translating an Indian name into English was mocked by the instructors. Children who spent several years at boarding school found that when they returned home to the reservation, they had difficulty communicating with their Ojibwe-speaking parents. What I would like to emphasize in this is that these children didn't necessarily get to go home for summer break. Instead of summer break, they were employed. And by the time they got back to the reservation with their Anishinaabe-speaking parents, they were speaking English and were having trouble remembering their language. They were having trouble communicating with their own parents. Because of the, I'm right where I want to be. Because of the inadequate sanitary conditions and the marginal diet, student health was often poor. Health conditions were made worse, however, by conscious decisions to enroll sick children and allow them to freely mingle with healthy students. I would like to point out that in rooms where you have 30 or 40 children and you put a sick child in, you know you're going to end up with many sick children. I think that a lot of us had a real eye-opener with what happened with our shutdown for the past couple years. The Spanish flu happened to have gone through the boarding schools. So there were issues of things that were happening there. So let me get back. Now that I brought up the Spanish flu, I think it's kind of important to realize that. There were epidemics of trachoma, tuberculosis, and other diseases. In the first years of the 20th century, over 1/2 of all the children in off-reservation boarding schools suffered from trachoma, an eye disease, which, if left untreated, causes blindness in approximately 1% of its victims. Trachoma is easily caught and usually associated with unsanitary conditions and poor living standards. And I think that you just heard there was no soap or toilet paper, so that's the reason for the eye problems. Death among students was not uncommon, and there was a policy not to share information with parents about minor illnesses, which could lead to stunning consequences. We're going to talk about the Indian food health experience. When you talk with people who have been to boarding schools, sometimes you hear a mixed bag. A lot of them complain, but you'll hear the one odd one that'll say that it was a good thing. I'm going off script right now and talking about the Cosley family. There was one person in their family that said it was a really good thing for her to be at the boarding school because she knew she was going to get fed. And it might not have been everything it should have been, but it was more than nothing, which is what was happening at home. And that's why I wanted to do the introduction of just how poor the eastern end of the UP is even today. Many students recall the food as being at least adequate. The Merrim report, however, was critical of the food. The report shows widespread malnutrition among the students and actual food shortages. The diet at the schools usually focused on meat, starches, with fresh vegetables or fruit rarely served. Schools emphasize the learning of agricultural skills and maintaining substantial farming operations. However, those cash crops were used to supplement the school's budget rather than to feed the students. The Merrim report estimated that to adequately feed children in the schools would cost 35 cents per day per student. The report calculated that the government actually spent 11 cents per day per student on food. The Indian experience with punishment. Infractions of many rules usually resulted in withdrawal of privileges or the assignment of extra work detail. However, more severe punishments also occurred. Students may be deprived of a meal. Girls were often forced to kneel for an extended period of time on a hard service, and boys and girls were occasionally beaten with a strap or rubber hose. Flogging with a whip was also allowed. Flogging and other extreme forms of punishment were not banned formally until 1929, but remained because of a 1930 statement that it be allowed in emergency situations. Students did run away. The most common reason cited for fleeing a boarding school was homesickness rather than poor treatment. Tribal police were used as the truant officers, so students were returned back to the schools. Off script again, if any of you have ever read Rabbit Proof Fence, It is an Australian experience. I highly recommend it. It is about the school runaways. So Michigan Indians today are very disconnected from parenting skills. We have generations and generations of children who were not in the homes with their parents. And there is also a spiritual disconnection from traditions. They were not there at the critical times to be able to be involved in traditions, and they were not passed on. We have new learned behaviors, something previously unseen, something learned at the boarding school, and that was domestic violence behavior. Before the boarding schools, we did not have this kind of problem of domestic violence. It was taken care of, like for example, with the Iroquois. I think most of you are probably acquainted with their involvement with the Constitution, and that our Congress mirrors the women's court, and that the person who was the leader was actually elected by the women. And he wore a headdress with horns, and when he was not in favor, he was dehorned. So what I'm trying to say is that there was a lot more emphasis on traditions and a lot more emphasis on a woman's place within the traditions. So there is also a lot, and where I'm going to be going with this is the solution for what we've been talking about, and what we're facing today is health disparities with diabetes and amputations at an extraordinary rate. There is a rise of diabetes among the indigenous Indians, with diet, obesity, and heredity as contributing factors. Health problems are increasing, with Indian Health Service reporting children having obesity rates of 40%, 4 times the rate for general population. Type 2 onset diabetes is increasingly being discovered in Indigenous American youth. Indigenous populations are high users of the health industry and are 3 times the risk than other adults. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this project and what I did. It was in 2007. I did surveying with 150 people in a closed-door meeting on the Mount Pleasant reservation. Everybody there was 100% to 50% blooded. And the results showed a gross undercount by the federal government and Indian Health Service. For the U.S. Census, studies performed by the Indian Health Service are based on only 14% of their available data. So they're extrapolating the numbers rather than using real numbers. Plus, there's another 40% of tribal people who never go to Indian Health Service. The federal government bases their numbers on the surveys that we do every 10 years. Unfortunately, there have been some very well-meaning people that have identified as being tribal, and they're very healthy. And it has skewed the statistics. When I did the survey of these 150 people, it wasn't a matter of 1 out of 18 being diabetic, like the federal government said. And it wasn't 1 out of 9 like Indian Health Service said. 1 out of 3 was already diabetic. Or that means out of 10 people, 3 of them were already diabetic, not just pre-diabetic. I'll bet right now you're wondering, how did I ever get to this from the boarding schools? I'm going to stop for a moment, and because I'm getting ready to talk about the solution to the diabetic situation. My feeling is that when you're reporting a problem, you have to come up with some kind of solutions that can be put forward. There are really no solutions that we can have for the boarding schools. They've been disbanded. A lot of the people have already died. They've walked on to the next world. The few that are remaining are being recognized, but they still have horror stories to tell. One that I heard just 2 weeks ago was when you heard about the clothes that were provided for the children. This man had gone to Holy Childhood. The priest had come around, and it was, I don't know if it was a bus or a station wagon, and he just did the roundup, took them across the streets, and then took them on to Holy Childhood. He told us about what it was like being in the boarding school, especially at night. Nobody wants to hear these people say what happened there. We all know what happened there. We see the suicides that happen after investigators had gone through Canada to ask about what had happened. We know these children were treated in the worst possible way. John talked about how there was a place they called the store. And when the federal people came around, all the kids were taken to the store, and they put on all the new clothes and the new boots and the new shoes, and they were paraded out for the feds. And as soon as the feds were gone, all the clothes went back into the store. John told me that he was there in the boarding school from the age of 5 to the age of 10. And he said if there was any one memory that will live with him forever, it's the crying in the dorms that went on all night long, every night. So these people have very little self-worth. They were taught that they were nothing. This is again off script, and this is a gut feeling for me. There was Kathleen LaPointe, a dear, dear woman, gentle, kind. She looked me in the eyes and said, "They made us feel dirty." And she kind of half smiled. And I'm kind of speaking up for the church part of this. I think that maybe because my people are born with a suntan, that what they were seeing was the ashiness that happens when the skin is dry. And the more the nuns complained that the kids were dirty, the more they scrubbed and the more ashy that they looked. So I've heard stories from at least a half dozen of the boarding school survivors about how they kept scrubbing and scrubbing and scrubbing. They were convinced that the nuns were right. So it was, you can't love others until you love yourself. And this was something where they're having trouble expressing themselves. When I worked with the elders, you'd ask them questions and they'd respond with anger. And it's because they were an empty bag. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to say. But the outcome is that they're all a very unhealthy bunch. So what I have proposed is a prevention program, and I'll explain a little bit of why the consequences of this are important to us even today. I've tried explaining to people that if there was a healthy eating program put in place, it might cost $2,500, but it would save you as a taxpayer $250,000 to $600,000. So I'll explain this with the lower extremity amputations and dialysis. So I'm back on script. One of the things that I can tell you right now is that I did have an advantage being an Anishinaabe principal investigator, because they will only be frank with another of their own. The last thing in the world they want to hear is, you're from the government and you're here because you're going to do something good. You're going to do something that's going to be really good for me. You won't even get in the door. So what I have done is I have developed a surveying tool for Native Americans. It's really easy for them, and I also have a 2 to 3 year spiritual health developed program where it involves nutrition and spirituality together. When I speak away from this, can you hear that at all? Oh. There may be a statistical way to determine if this survey could be used as a culturally sensitive assessment tool to help other tribes gather together grants for targeting high-risk community members for follow-up health interventions by analyzing the study's data and then instituting culturally sensitive health intervention programming to lower diabetic susceptibility. LEA prevention efforts may be especially effective with the Native American group. Implications to this as a health policy would be a benefit both to the insurance system and to patients to alleviate the expensive drain on the insurance system from hospital usage and ongoing medical care for diabetic complications. One of the worst problems that we can get into is having a young woman have gestational diabetes. The longer a person has diabetes, the more likely that there's going to be lower extremity amputation. There is a need for the development and distribution of educational print for cultural competency for the healthcare industry, for providers who may not recognize community members and their high likelihood of being diabetic. The point I'm trying to make is that Native Americans are also Caucasians. They just have this high propensity for diabetes. And if a healthcare provider doesn't know to look for this, he can accidentally miss possibility of stopping a diabetic problem. Sally Joy, the National Kidney Foundation, stated the longer a person is diabetic, the greater the likelihood to become kidney dialysis dependent and suffer from lower extremity amputation. The strain upon the healthcare system is that dialysis expense for 1 year for one person is $50,000 to $60,000. And the expense for one person with lower extremity amputation is $500,000 to $600,000. The benefits to Western society of monetary savings by delay of onset of diabetes and amputation is difficult to calculate and integrate into the scientific merit of a proposed system. In other words, it's hard to get money for prevention. It's always easier, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. It's hard to prove how many people would have had a problem that you did manage to prevent. So it's hard to gather scientific merit on prevention programs. However, it can be measured against peace of mind, good health that can be derived from participating in one's own health. Tribal people today are faced with another form of genocide through diabetes in the 21st century. And it will take a great deal, but there must be some proactivity to save the lives of members through culturally sensitive health interventions. The strength of the Anishinaabegs lies in the spirituality of the people. Even with the terrible legacy of the Dawes Act, Anishinaabe remain grounded in their culture. programs that are centered on community activities and interest on the membership, and tap into culturally holistic intergenerational program will succeed. So I managed to talk about the boarding schools and tell you what I thought that we need to address next.
Thanks. I know we started a little bit late, so it is 7:30, but let's take some time for some Q&A. But first, let's give a round of applause to our speakers.
Do we have any questions?
I think so.
When you were talking about the boarding schools, you're talking about losing culture. The children that were there were losing their culture, and that was the idea. What is being done to reintroduce the culture back?
Okay. Well, I can only speak for my own tribe, and I'm very pleased to be able to talk about this. I had done so well in my rural elder programming that my tribal chair actually created a job for me as resource specialist for our tribe. And he told me that what he wanted was he wanted an ANA grant written. That was special funding for Native Americans for revival of language. So the good old boys that my tribal chair had been relying on told him it was impossible to write that grant. It was to cover over 8,500 square miles. I had the grant written in about 7 months, and it got funded. It was a 4-year grant. And when my tribe decided to accept the grant, when they put their paper with it that had gone through tribal council, that opened the door and actually created our cultural department. We did not have a cultural department until it was talked about in that grant. And with the passage of that by the board, we then began a very, very hard regaining of our culture. I have managed to go to MSU and take 2 years of college level Ojibwe. We have Ojibwe that's being taught to Ojibwe and Chippewa are the same thing, by the way. It's just an O in front of Chippewa, it's the same word. The O means the people who left. So there's Chippewa and Ojibwe, and that's like the people that went on the other side of the river. So we're working very hard at it. And as you have seen with the powwows, and we're taking advantage of being able to reclaim some of these things.
Can you tell us about your center in Hazlet?
Oh, sure. It's kind of an interesting thing what happened, because when we were working on getting those first numbers of the diabetes in the area, there was a lot of talk about the Indian Center, and there had been an Indian Center in Lansing. The problem is, like many things, it was hard because of mismanagement. So we really tried to figure out what we were going to do with having a center. And we had a board of directors, and by the way, one of our board directors was a boarding school survivor, Ken Byron, who was also on our board. The first board set the atmosphere for what we were going to do. And what we decided was that it was vanity to have a building. And further, we couldn't not afford the rent, we couldn't even afford a desk. We took a look at the Hispanics group and found it would be about $9,000 to have a desk there. The the problem that we got into with having public events, and we did have a beautiful event at Lake Lansing, is that the insurance that we had to have for events was the same insurance that Crystal Ray, a 3-story building with a basement, had to have so that we could have that event. It cost us something like $2,500 it was a crazy thing on the insurances. So what we do is we have a virtual center. It is a public charity. It's not just a 501c3. After our 5-year test, the Internal Revenue got in touch with us and let us know that we got the mark of Sterling of a 170. I don't know as if there's another one in the state of Michigan. And as far as an Indian charity in the country, it may be the only one. And what the 170 is about is how much administrative money do you take out of there? We take nothing. We take nothing out of there. I also can't get anybody to do my job because nobody's willing to work for free. But every penny that Anishinaabegamig gets goes to our clients. Typically, we end up helping out people that fall between the cracks, maybe somebody who's not on their reservation, or we've gotten calls from the Department of Civil Rights here in Lansing and from HHS with people that have fallen between the cracks, like over Christmas and stuff like that, where we help out. We've helped with auctions. We put shoes on 50 pairs of shoes on poor Indian children's feet here in Grand Rapids. We did an auction to raise money for an elder who had eye surgery that went wrong, and she needed another surgery to correct it. And we raised that money. So we do a lot of odd things. It's whatever happens to be appropriate at the time. We've had a drum group. All of our boys have grown up. We've had craft nights, flute lessons, just all kinds of different things. But it's a matter of meeting whatever the need seems to be at the time.
You may have mentioned this and I missed it, but at what point in time did the boarding schools start to get phased out? Obviously, it's pretty recently if you still know survivors.
You'll hear a lot of different years mentioned. So I'm going to go through the years. I think I'm going to backtrack to Andersonville too. Some of this stuff actually started in the 1830s. This got a little bit more formal in the 1860s, before the Civil War and then after the Civil War. The really bad boarding school stuff had stopped around 1965. But the funding didn't stop until 1982. So there's the kind of boarding schools that we're talking in the first part. And then I went to parochial school, and boy, it sure sounded a lot like the boarding schools to me up there. Yeah, there are people that say that they went to boarding schools. My mother went to, there's only Berga, Mount Pleasant, Industrial, Holy Childhood of Jesus, and there was also another school that was on Mackinac Island. So those were the spots. I have been past the school on Mackinac Island, and you can just feel that building. It is the saddest feeling that you get when you're around that building. My mother was in a convent school, and her parents paid for her to be there in St. Ignace. So there are other things that did occur, but the really bad ones were done by 65.
What do childhood education modes look like now in your community?
Education
Or
modes.
just, what does education look like in a potentially dispersed rural community?
Well, for a start, we have our own tribal school. So with our tribal school, we're able to have our own tribal teachers in there and do things that are cultural as well. We're offering a lot more events. They're part of this grant with the language included having field activities out there. We're doing more with, we have a cultural camp. The children are taken, invited out there. We still do make-whole serving. So those kind of camps actually exist and are being resurrected, and we are reclaiming our culture. The problem is we will never know what we've lost. There is one other thing that I wanted to talk about, and that was Andersonville, because in the long run, this ends up being an upbeat thing. For those of you that ever saw the movie of Andersonville, I don't know if you ever saw it. It's assuming a lot that you would have seen the Civil War movie. The Confederates didn't have enough food to feed their own soldiers, and they certainly didn't have enough food for the men in that prison. And it was a horrible place to be. It's a federal park now. There's a river that goes through it, and it's walled. But as different groups would come in, there was a bunch that was called the Marauders. And the Marauders would start chanting, and they'd say, fresh fish, fresh fish, fresh fish. And they'd circle the new people. And they'd take everything from them. Boots, food, clothing, money, anything of value. They were stripped of anything of value. And this went on and on and on. Until one day, when Company K, Michigan's Anishinaabe sharpshooters, showed up. There were a few of them, but there was only about 9 that were captured. It could have been more. I'm not sure the exact number. They walked in, and it started again. Fresh fish, fresh fish, fresh fish. And the Anishinaabe formed a circle back to back, and they fought off the Marauders. This was something that the Confederates had not been happy about, and they didn't know what to do with the Marauders. And they were very happy to see that Company K was able to do this. And in the movie, as it continues on, they show that there is a trial of these people. They are executed, and they are buried outside of the area that the other soldiers were buried in. The only thing that the movie doesn't say is that the people that stopped this was Company K. Now, I've talked with Cynthia Stormcaller. She is the person who's the director of the Andersonville Park. And I said, Cynthia, do I have this story right? I said, am I telling this correctly? That our sharpshooters were able to do something that literally thousands of Union soldiers before them could not do? She said, you got the story right. So I do want to add something that is a little more uplifting, even though we're talking about the Civil War and that prison. That was a pretty incredible accomplishment, and one that hasn't been directly shown to be from the Anishinaabe, but it's something of great pride.
Could you repeat the name of the book that you suggested, of the Aboriginal?
Oh, sure. That, it's also a movie. It's Rabbit Proof Fence.
What is it?
Rabbit Proof Fence. These girls followed the rabbit proof fence back home.
That's the Australian one?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a book?
It's a book.
And a book.
Before I have my closing remarks for the evening, perhaps we can have one more comment where you can talk about your own book that you're selling outside, because you can see that was a great story that you told, and there are more stories to tell. So please tell us more about how the little people stole my laptop.
Okay. Well, I've also tried to do a lot of different things and taking advantage of all the opportunities that have been given to me from being in Lower Michigan. And some of the things that I've done is apprenticeships. One apprenticeship is in doing birch bark cutout work, and I was acknowledged as the 2020 Michigan Heritage Award winner for that work. It's a resurrection of an old art form. I also work with stone and did a formal apprenticeship in making women's prayer pipes. But the one apprenticeship that I really had a lot of fun with was the storytelling. I'm going to tell another story in here. That's what happens when you get a storyteller started, is that I had approached a gentleman whose name was Larry Plamondon. And I said to him that I would like to do this, and I would like him to be my master storyteller. Well, I'd known Larry from tribal events, but I didn't really know Larry until after we started the apprenticeship. He gave me a lot of great teaching as far as how to do storytelling, but it turned out that Larry has his own story too, and I would call this the Larry Law. Larry had apparently been in Ann Arbor as a young man, and his house, where he had rented a room, had a drug raid, and the authorities didn't find anything in his room about drugs, but they did find something about a building that had been blown up. And I think some of us might remember back in the early 70s that there was a federal building that belonged to the FBI that got exploded on a weekend. Well, they saw some blueprints that looked awfully incriminating. And this ended up being a very, very big deal. John Lennon and Yoko actually did a concert for him. And this went to the Supreme Court. And that's why I call it the Larry Law. And it's still on the books that if the police are doing a search and they find evidence of something else, they cannot use that evidence against you. So, having already made Secret Service clearance myself and driven in a presidential motorcade, I was rather mortified. However, Larry was a great mentor, and I did create a book that is for sale out in our lobby area, and it is called How the Little People Stole My Wampum. It is all about Mackinac Island. The stories have a little bit of truth in them. For instance, I was telling one of the ladies, I really was reverse pickpocketed by a midget on Mackinac Island. I had some wampum taken, and I got back a green peg instead, a cribbage peg. That was my trade item. That's what was put in my pocket. But I think that you would enjoy the book because all of our stories and all of our legends have sad endings to a T, every single one of them. The Robin story, everything. The Lost Daughter of Leelanau, they're all very sad stories. So I wanted to do something that would put a smile on people's faces. And I think there's a little bit of something in this book for everybody. The last 5 stories are Christmas stories, and the last one is the Christmas potato, and it is a story of gratitude. So if you're interested, I hope you would have fun with it.